All PDM systems require a mechanism for locking items out to a user so that they have exclusive rights to modify them, and this is a basic differentiator that a PDM system provides over and above working on the file system. In DDM, this mechanism is provided by a simple, elegant solution called a workbench. Each user in the system has their own workbench where they reserve items that they're working on. Once reserved to the workbench, these items can only be modified by this user. The workbench is simply a folder in DDM, but a folder that is uniquely owned by the user. So here I have my workbench, and we can currently see that I have one new item reserved to my workbench. What we're going to look at is the way that we interact with project folders. So before I do that, it's going to be useful to pin my workbench so that I can see it under my pinned folders. And here under my pinned folders, I can see the current projects that I'm working on. So I have all of the information available to me from this window. If we take a look in this project, there is a document that I need to work on. And so here we have a test procedure that's work in progress, currently owned by project members. So it might be helpful to consider project folders like the filing cabinet in the office, which holds all of the project documents. Project members have shared access to this resource, and so if I need to work on this document, then I should reserve it to my workbench. So if we right click and use reserve to folder, then because I have my workbench pinned and in the reserve to dialog I have my pinned folders selected, I only see the folders that I'm currently interested in, and so I'm going to reserve this item to my workbench. And so we can now see that the item is reserved to the workbench, yet it is still referenced in the project folder. We can see that in another way if we open up the properties of this document and go to links and look at the folders that this item is associated with. Then again we can see that the item is reserved to my workbench but referenced to the project folder. If we take a look in the project folder, we're just going to make one more setting in here. So here we can see all of the items belonging to this project, whether they're CAD models or whether they're documents. What would be useful to see in this window is who has the items reserved and who is working on them. So if we right click up here and select part attributes reserved by, then we can see who is working on these individual items, and we can see here that Mark has this item reserved from the project folder and reserved to his workbench. If we're working on CAD items, we may potentially have more than one item that we need to reserve. So if we're working within a subassembly, we should really reserve all of the items in the subassembly as well. So if we come to this top level assembly item here and select to load it, the easiest way to do this is from the load window itself. So here I can see all of the items in the assembly, and if I want to work on this subassembly, then I can multi-select the items from the subassembly and right click and reserve them. So again we use reserve to folder. I'm going to put them on my workbench, and now we can immediately see who has items reserved and if we're allowed to reserve them for modification. So I can now load that into session and continue to do my work, and I would save my changes back. In this case we're just going to close this and return to DDM. If I just refresh this, we can now see that I have a number of items starting to build up on my workbench. It's important that we take responsibility for reserving items that we're finished with back to the project folder so that other people who we may be collaborating with have the opportunity to continue with their work. So the simplest way to do this is to take these items and just reserve them back to the project folder. So now we can see that these items are still referenced on my workbench, but they have been reserve back to the project folder. So in keeping our workbenches tidy, we can remove referenced items. So if we select these items, just right click and we can say remove from folder, and now those items have been removed from my workbench. So it's important to think of your workbench as your desk, and we only want the items that we're currently working on our desk, so we need to keep it tidy. There may be occasions when a user has items reserved to their workbench and they're not available to reserve them back to the project folder. For example, if the user is ill or is unexpectedly away from the office. In this case, another project member can ask an administrator to transfer ownership of the item to another project member. So if we take a look at how this works, we can see in this project that this item has been reserved by Joe. And if he's not available to unreserve the items, then we may need to ask an administrator to transfer ownership of that item to another user. So if we log in as an administrator, we can look at users' workbenches, and if we look for Joe's workbench, then we can see this item locked to the workbench. So as an administrator, we can send this item to another user. And now if we return to DDM, we just refresh the search results, we can see that I now have that item reserved, and I can either work on it, or if I've finished with it, I can reserve it back to the project folder. So an overview of how we can manage our workbenches and try and keep the information in there just limited to the items that we're currently working on.